At my daughter's graduation, my dad announced I stole her $80K trust fund. Then her lawyer stood up. The gymnasium smelled like cheap perfume and floor wax. 600 folding chairs, 600 families, and in the third row, mine, or what was left of it. My daughter Emma was 3 names away from walking across that stage. Valedictorian. Full ride to Cornell starting in the fall. 17 years of single motherhood, double shifts at the hospital, and generic brand everything so she could have name brand opportunities. All of it distilled into one walk across a stage. Then my father stood up. He didn't wait for the microphone. He grabbed it off the podium mid-ceremony, right out of the principal's hand, and he turned to face 600 strangers. "Before this goes any further," he said, "I think everyone should know what kind of woman is sitting in that third row. Diane didn't save for her daughter's college. She stole it. $80,000 from a trust fund I set up for Emma. Gone. And she let this school hand her daughter a scholarship like she actually did something right." The gym went dead silent. 600 heads turned toward me at once. And that's when the side door opened, and a woman in a gray suit walked in carrying a leather folder. Emma's lawyer. Emma's own lawyer, that even I didn't know existed. She stood, and she said one sentence that made my father's face go white as the podium behind him. I'll get to that sentence. But first, you need to understand exactly how we got to this gymnasium, and exactly how much my father had already taken from us before he ever opened his mouth. Who we were. My name is Diane. I was 23 when Emma was born, and her father left before she turned 1, not dramatically, no scene, just a moving truck and a change of phone number. I don't talk about him much because there's nothing to say. He wasn't the villain of this story. My father made sure of that. Robert Whitfield, my dad, built a construction supply business from nothing in the 1980s. By the time I was in high school, he had 4 warehouses and a reputation in our town for being a man people either respected or feared, depending on whether they owed him money. He wasn't cruel to strangers. He saved that for family. Strangers he needed. Family he owned. My mother died when I was 26, 2 years after Emma was born. That's the year everything changed, because my mother had been the only person who could soften my father, and once she was gone, there was nothing left to soften with. The trust fund. Here's the part that matters for later, so pay attention. When Emma was 3, my father called me into his office. He always called people into his office, even his own daughter, even at Thanksgiving. And he told me he was setting up a trust fund for her. $80,000 to be released when she turned 18, for college. I remember exactly what he said. "This isn't for you, Diane. This is so she doesn't end up like you." I let that sting, and I said thank you anyway, because $80,000 for my daughter's future was worth swallowing a decade of comments like that. I'd been swallowing them since I was young enough to know better than to swallow them. For the next 15 years, my father brought up that trust fund constantly, at every birthday, every report card, every time I asked him for anything, even something as small as watching Emma for an afternoon. He'd remind me that he was already doing more than enough by funding her future. It became leverage, a leash disguised as generosity. The warning signs. 2 years before the graduation, things started shifting in ways I didn't understand yet. My father started asking Emma to come to his office alone. Just the 2 of them. Grandfather-granddaughter time, he called it. Emma was 15, 16 by then, old enough to have her own relationship with him, and I didn't want to be the mother who controlled who her daughter loved. So I let it happen. What I didn't know was that during those visits, my father was building a story. Slowly, patiently, the way he built everything. A warehouse, a reputation, a trap. He started asking Emma questions that sounded innocent but weren't. "Has your mom mentioned the trust fund lately? Does she ever talk about needing money? You'd tell me if something seemed off, right?" Emma, being a good kid who trusted her grandfather, answered honestly. "No, I never mentioned the trust fund. No, I never talked about needing money, because I didn't. I worked, I paid our bills. I never touched a cent of that account, because it wasn't mine to touch. But my father wasn't collecting information. He was engineering a narrative, and he needed Emma to unknowingly help him build it, so that later, when he needed witnesses who'd believe him without question, she'd already have half-formed doubts he could sharpen into certainty. The real trust fund story. Here is what my father never told anyone, including Emma, including me, until it came out in front of 600 people at a graduation ceremony. The trust fund was never $80,000 sitting untouched for 15 years. My father had structured it as a revocable trust, meaning he retained control of it, could access it, could modify it, and legally, none of it required my signature or my involvement at any point. 3 years before the graduation, my father took $45,000 out of that trust to cover a bad investment in a warehouse expansion that failed. He replaced about half of it over the following 2 years from other funds, but he never fully replenished it, and he never told a single person. Then, as Emma's 18th birthday approached and the trust was set to release, my father realized he was going to come up short, and instead of admitting what he'd done, he decided the story needed a different thief. Me. Setting the trap. 3 weeks before graduation, my father called me and asked if we could get lunch, just the two of us. I should have known something was wrong immediately. My father did not do casual lunches. But I went, because some small, stupid part of me still wanted a version of him that could sit across a table and just talk. At that lunch, he told me he was concerned about some withdrawals from Emma's trust account and asked if I knew anything about them. I told him honestly that I'd never touched that account, didn't have access to it, and didn't even know the account number. He nodded slowly, in that way he had of nodding when he'd already decided you were lying and was just letting you dig deeper. He said, "I hope that's true, Diane, for your sake." I didn't understand it then. I understand it now. That lunch wasn't him seeking information. It was him building his alibi, so that later he could say he'd given me a chance to come clean, and I hadn't. What I didn't know, and wouldn't find out until much later, was that my father had spent the previous month doing something far more calculated than confronting me directly. He'd been quietly altering bank records connected to a secondary account, one that existed under a slight variation of my name, D. Whitfield, instead of Diane Whitfield, an account he had, in fact, opened himself 2 years earlier without my knowledge, using my social security number that he'd had on file from when he co-signed my very first apartment lease at 22. He was building a paper trail that would make it look, on the surface, like money from Emma's trust had passed through an account tied to me. Graduation week. The week before graduation should have been the best week of my life. Emma had gotten into Cornell. She'd been named valedictorian. She'd spent 4 years balancing AP classes with a part-time job at a coffee shop because she wanted her own spending money and didn't want to rely on anyone. A trait I recognized immediately because it was mine. My father, meanwhile, had gone unusually quiet. No calls about the trust fund, no pointed comments. I remember telling my coworker at the hospital that the silence felt strange, and she said maybe he was just being nice for once. I didn't believe that, but I wanted to. 2 days before the ceremony, Emma came to me with something that made my stomach drop. "Grandpa asked me something weird," she said. "He asked if I'd noticed you buying anything expensive lately, like a car or jewelry or anything." I asked her what she'd told him. I said no, obviously. Why would he ask that? I didn't have an answer for her, but I had a feeling, the kind that sits low in your stomach and doesn't leave. I called my father that night and asked him directly what was going on. He told me I was being paranoid and that I should focus on being proud of my daughter instead of making everything about myself. He hung up before I could respond. The night before graduation, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every strange comment from the past 2 years. The private meetings with Emma, the lunch, the questions about spending. Something in my gut told me my father was building towards something, but I told myself I was overthinking it. He was 71 years old. Surely even he had limits. I was wrong about that. He had never had limits. I'd just spent my whole life mistaking his patience for restraint. What I didn't know that night was that Emma had also noticed something strange, but hers came from a different direction entirely. 2 months earlier, during her senior economics class, Emma had done a project on estate planning and trusts, taught by a teacher who happened to be a retired paralegal. Curious about her own trust fund, Emma had asked her teacher, hypothetically, how she could check on a trust that was set up in her name. The teacher, thinking nothing of it, explained that as the named beneficiary turning 18, Emma had a legal right to request an accounting of the trust directly from the financial institution managing it, even before the funds released. She didn't need her grandfather's permission. Emma, quietly, without telling me, had requested that accounting 3 weeks before graduation. She hadn't told me because she didn't want to upset anyone if it turned out to be nothing. She was protecting me the same way I'd spent her whole life protecting her. What came back in that accounting was the $45,000 withdrawal my father had made 3 years earlier, a withdrawal with no explanation attached, made by the trust's sole signer, Robert Whitfield. Emma didn't confront him. She did something smarter. She called a family friend who happened to be an attorney, explained what she'd found, and asked what her options were as the beneficiary. That attorney, a woman named Patricia Voss, told her that if the trust had, in fact, been mismanaged by the trustee, Emma would have every legal right to pursue an accounting and potential restitution once she turned 18, which happened to be exactly 9 days before graduation. Patricia Voss offered to attend the graduation as a precaution in case Emma needed support. Emma agreed. Neither of them told me. Emma didn't want to ruin my one moment of pride watching her walk across that stage by dragging me into a legal mess before it needed to happen. She had no idea her grandfather was about to try to make the mess about me publicly, before anyone had the chance to address it privately. The morning of graduation, my father called me at 7 a.m., unusual, since he rarely called before 9. He asked if I'd be sitting in the family section or somewhere else. I told him the family section, obviously, where else would I sit? He said, and I remember this exactly, "Just checking. I want to make sure everyone who needs to see this sees it." I thought he meant Emma walking across the stage. I was wrong. He meant me. The ceremony. The gymnasium was packed by 9:45. I sat in the third row on the aisle, next to my sister Karen, who'd flown in from Ohio. My father sat 2 rows behind us with his second wife, Denise, close enough to see me, far enough to seem uninvolved if anyone asked later. The ceremony moved through the alphabet in reverse for some reason none of us understood, Z names first. And Emma, a W, was near the middle. I watched name after name cross that stage and felt my chest tighten with a kind of pride I didn't have words for. Then, right after a boy named Marcus Weller walked off stage, and just before the principal called Emma's name, my father stood up. He didn't hesitate. He walked to the aisle, and because the ceremony had a small sound system with a handheld mic used for family shout-outs between names, a tradition at this particular school, he reached the podium area and took it directly from the assistant principal's hand before anyone could stop him. "Before this goes any further," he said, his voice booming through the gymnasium speakers, "I think everyone should know what kind of woman is sitting in that third row." I felt Karen's hand grip my arm. I felt 600 heads start to turn. My daughter, Diane, was entrusted with managing money that was meant for Emma's education. $80,000. And instead of protecting it, she drained it. Stole from her own child. And now she's sitting here today, letting this school hand Emma an achievement Diane had nothing to do with, while pretending she's some kind of hero. The room had gone from 600 separate conversations to one single, suffocating silence. I could hear the air conditioning. I could hear someone's chair creak 3 rows back. I could feel my face burning, not from shame, but from something closer to disbelief, the specific disbelief of watching someone you know completely commit an act you never thought even they were capable of. I stood up. I don't remember deciding to stand. My body just did it. I opened my mouth to say something. I don't even know what. And that's when the side door of the gymnasium opened. The lawyer stands. A woman in a gray suit walked through it, She moved with the kind of calm that only comes from someone who has done something like this before and knows exactly how it ends. She walked directly up the center aisle, past my row, past my father, and stopped at the edge of the stage. "My name is Patricia Voss," she said, loud enough that she didn't need the microphone my father was still holding. "I'm an attorney, and I'm here on behalf of Emma Whitfield, who retained me 2 weeks ago, prior to her 18th birthday, in anticipation of exactly this kind of accusation." My father's face didn't move at first. I think he genuinely didn't understand what was happening. "Mr. Whitfield," Patricia continued, "3 weeks ago, Emma requested a formal accounting of the trust you have sole signing authority over. That accounting shows a $45,000 withdrawal made 3 years ago, by you, not by Diane, who has never had signing access to that account. It also shows a secondary account opened in a name closely resembling Diane's, using her social security number without her authorization, which is a separate legal matter we are prepared to address." The gymnasium, somehow, got even quieter. "So before you finish accusing your daughter of theft in front of 600 witnesses," Patricia said, "I'd encourage you to sit down, because everything you just said publicly is now part of a defamation claim we are prepared to file by Monday morning." My father lowered the microphone. For the first time in my entire life, I watched my father have absolutely nothing to say. Into that silence, the principal, visibly unsure what to do, but understanding that the ceremony had to continue, cleared his throat and called the next name. "Emma Whitfield." Emma stood up from the graduate section, walked past the podium where her grandfather still stood frozen, took her diploma, and before she walked off stage, she stopped at the microphone he'd set back on its stand. She was 17 years old, about to turn 18 in 9 days, and she said 4 sentences that I will remember until the day I die. "My mom worked 2 jobs so I could focus on school instead of worrying about money. She never touched that trust fund, because it was never hers to touch. I'm the one who found out where the money actually went, and I'm the one who called the lawyer." Then she walked off the stage, into my arms, in front of everyone who had just watched her grandfather try to destroy her mother's reputation and fail in real time. The rest of the ceremony happened in a kind of fog. Names were called, families cheered, but the entire gymnasium had shifted its attention permanently to our section, and I could feel it. Not judgment anymore, but something closer to sympathy mixed with disbelief. My father left before the ceremony ended. Denise practically dragged him out through the side exit, his face gray, his hands visibly shaking. Karen leaned over and whispered, "I have never in my life seen him lose control of a room like that." Neither had I. That was the whole point. He'd never lost control of anything in his life, and losing it in front of 600 people, live, with no way to spin it, broke something in him that I don't think ever fully repaired. Patricia Voss met with me and Emma 2 days later at her office to explain exactly what we were dealing with. The $45,000 withdrawal was clearly documented, dated, and tied directly to my father's signature. The secondary account opened in a variation of my name was more serious. It constituted identity misuse, and Patricia recommended we report it, both to protect Emma's remaining trust funds and to protect me from any future attempt to blame me for withdrawals made from an account I never opened. We didn't go for blood. That was never who Emma or I wanted to be, no matter what my father had tried to become. Instead, Patricia negotiated directly with my father's own attorney. The terms were simple. My father would fully replenish the trust, immediately, with interest calculated from the date of the original withdrawal. He would issue a written retraction of his public statements, sent to the school administration so it could be shared with any family who'd been present and asked about it afterward. And the secondary account would be closed permanently, with a notarized statement confirming I had no involvement in its creation or use. My father agreed to all of it within a week. Not because he'd developed a conscience, I think, but because Patricia made it very clear that a criminal referral for identity misuse was the alternative. And even my father understood that a 71-year-old man with a business reputation to protect did not want that hanging over him. Emma started at Cornell that fall with her trust fund fully restored, exactly as it should have been years earlier. She calls me most Sundays. She still keeps her part-time coffee shop habits, works during the summer, pays for her own things when she can, because, as she told me on the phone once, I don't want to owe anyone the kind of debt that gives them permission to do what Grandpa did. I understood that sentence more than she probably realizes. As for my father, I haven't spoken to him since that lunch 6 weeks after graduation, when he called and asked if we could put this behind us as a family. I told him that families don't stand up at graduations and call their daughters thieves in front of 600 strangers, and that some things don't get put behind you. They just become the reason you finally stop waiting for someone to change. He hasn't called since. I think about that gymnasium sometimes. The silence after he grabbed that microphone, the sound of Patricia's voice cutting through it, the 4 sentences Emma said before she walked off that stage and into my arms. 17 years of double shifts and generic brand groceries and swallowing comments I shouldn't have had to swallow, and in the end, it wasn't a courtroom or a confrontation that vindicated me. It was my daughter. Standing at a podium, in a cap and gown, telling the truth in front of everyone who needed to hear it.